The Resident Evil series is one of my personal favorite franchises when it comes to stuff from Capcom, right alongside with the Blue Bomber himself. And ever since Resident Evil 7, it feels like Capcom has been on a freaking roll with the series with 6 pretty stellar releases throughout the last 9 years. And while some of the games were better than others, it definitely feels like it's the best time to be a Resident Evil fan. Especially since the franchise is currently celebrating its 30th anniversary, which is a pretty big milestone. Although I should mention is that even though I'm a fan of the Resident Evil series, I'm more so kind of like a casual fan. Like, I really do like the games, but the only reason why I say that because I haven't really played every single mainline game. As the first ever Resident Evil game that I ever played was on my Nintendo Switch with Resident Evil 4, as that was actually a game that I've seen my cousin play a lot back on the Nintendo Wii. And after that, I've played through Resident Evil 7 and Village, which I had a really good time playing through those. And then I played through the entirety of the remake trilogy, and I thought those were fantastic games. The quality did dip with the Resident Evil 3 remake, and I know out of all the recent games, that one's definitely the most polarizing one, as it cuts out huge chunks of the original game, which I really can't say too much because I've never actually played the original Resident Evil 3. Although I did play through Resident Evil 1, and most recently I played through Resident Evil 2 on the Nintendo 64. As I'm a huge sucker for those games that really pushes the consoles to their limits. And I thought it was really cool that they were able to put the whole 2-disc game into a cartridge, which were known to barely have any file sizes in them. And frankly, even though that I never grew up with these games, I thought they hold up pretty well. Like, the tank controls were definitely a bit of a learning curve, but within like 20 or 30 minutes, you get the hang of it and it flows really well. And all of this leads to Resident Evil Requiem, and I remember the date that this was first revealed during the Summer Game Fest, which I'll be completely honest, really caught me off guard as it was shown at the near end of the event, but before that, they had a video regarding like Resident Evil's anniversary, and I thought that was going to be the end of it. But no, they revealed Resident Evil 9, which is going to be coming out the same year as the series' anniversary. Which was pretty cool, but what really got me very hyped for this game was during the last Nintendo Direct, where it was announced that this brand new, highly anticipated Resident Evil game is coming out on the Nintendo Switch 2. Which, as a longtime Nintendo player, this was an amazing thing to hear, as for the longest time, Nintendo never really had the third-party support like this, where the Nintendo platform gets the big next-gen game alongside with the other big platforms, and when it does, back on the OG Switch, it's always the worst version because how far behind Nintendo was with power. But with the Nintendo Switch 2, that is a completely different story, as this is a console for the very first time since the GameCube, where Nintendo's main focus was on its power. And thanks to this, the gap between a Nintendo console and the other platforms are significantly smaller compared to the previous consoles. Meaning that now I can play dozens and dozens of hours through Yoshi's Island again, as well as playing the newest big next-gen games. And so yeah, for this video, my main platform is on the Nintendo Switch 2. As when it finally released, I was able to get the Generations Pack. The game keycard thing is still pretty annoying, but at the same time, this is honestly a really good deal. As not only I paid full price for Resident Evil Requiem, but also for additional $20, I also got Resident Evil 7 and 8 on the go. Now, this is going to be a very interesting video for my channel, as this is the first time I ever talk about like a big M-rated game. As for my usual videos, I mostly do stuff on either like Nintendo or 3D cartoony platformers. I mean, hell, my last video was on Yoshi's Woolly World, a game that has a tone and art style like this, and now I'm jumping all the way to a game like this. So yeah, this is definitely a big tonal whiplash for this channel, and I hope to God I don't take off YouTube. So for this video, I'm just gonna pretend I'm doing a video on Yoshi's Island or something. But with everything out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so just booting up the game right now, and okay, just asking me to set up some settings, signing up the agreement, or whatever. Yeah, I'll sell myself to Capcom and such. But anyway, so after that, we have the title screen, and man, this is a pretty nice looking one. As I like how it's mostly pan shots of this office in the dark, where it's nothing but these crime scene investigations, pretty fitting on what you're going to be experiencing, with the blurred on the bottom saying something about facing the past. Okay, so the story begins in an FBI facility where our poor soul of the night being Grace Ashcroft, who's currently working on a big report where lately a bunch of people have been reported either missing or discovered being dead, where their deaths fall under a mysterious pattern where there's just bruises all over their arms. But then suddenly, Grace's boss Nathan tells her to come to his office, where he explains to Grace is that they were able to find another victim and wants her to go there to try and investigate. which so happens to be the Renwood Hotel, which is a place that's been abandoned for years. And it also so happens to be the place where Grace's mother was brutally murdered right before her eyes. Yeah. I should mention that Nathan isn't really forcing Grace to go, but he thought that going to the hotel would be a good place for Grace to face the past, and despite the task being completely optional, Grace decides to go through with it, probably just to face her inner demons and have some closure. And so she heads off, and wow, holy crap, this game looks really good. I don't usually like to go into graphics this early in the video, but I've really gotta say is that Resident Evil Requiem looks freaking amazing on the Nintendo Switch 2. From the highly detailed character models, the lighting, the environments, it's honestly surreal to having this level of detail on a Nintendo console. And all of this is also running at 60 FPS as well, so not only you have really good detail, but also it feels very good to play as well. Now obviously when it comes to other platforms, they definitely have better fidelity and such, but keep in mind, the Switch 2 itself is a pretty small system, which honestly makes it very impressive as you're going to be playing with all of this on the go. I think the only actual thing that does look a bit funky in this version is probably with the hair. But if you're playing this on like a TV or something, it's probably not going to be that noticeable. But yeah, pretty big AAA, big blockbuster game, pretty good. I want milk right now. But anyway, so the first section, you're mostly exploring around as Grace, trying to get to the abandoned hotel.
Oh, you're FBI?
I am.
And all of this leads when Grace finally shows up at the hotel, which seriously has seen better days, but as Grace tries to investigate around, something is clearly not right, as Grace will soon find out is that she's not the only person in that place, as she explores and finds these frankly creepy photos of her just walking around and such like someone is stalking her. Which gets even worse as Grace ends up being trapped into the hotel, and as she tries to find a way out, she eventually stumbles upon a room with even more photos of her, including one that was taken the night that her mother was murdered. Okay, time to finally go into that detail. So about 8 years before the events of Requiem, one fateful night, a teenage Grace alongside with her mother were staying at the hotel. As Grace's mother so happens to be Alyssa Ashcroft, who, fun fact, was actually a deep-cut Resident Evil character who first appeared in a small spin-off called Outbreak. So while the two were exploring to find new jobs, Alyssa has been noticing that a mysterious person has been following them. And because this leads Alyssa to be a bit on edge, especially when the hotel's power goes out, which is basically the cue for the two to run off immediately. And as they head to the first floor, they come across with the hotel's manager, who explains that the power outage is not really a big deal, as the hotel is about 90 years old, so because of that, the actual power is not really that stable. However, as they try to discuss things, a mysterious hooded man then just suddenly appears and brutally kills the manager. As the two try to escape, Grace goes into full panic mode as she tries to call the cops as her mother tries to calm her down. But then suddenly, the same hooded man appears again and then brutally kills Alyssa in front of Grace. Which I've gotta say, holy crap, this actually did disturb me when I first saw it. Like, usually when it comes to the Resident Evil games, they usually have like a lot of deaths. But there's something like this one that felt very more realistic than usual. Especially with Grace's reaction, because holy shit! Yeah, that's pretty freaking devastating. But anyway, so as Grace tries to pull herself together, she then remembered that on that night, her mother also hid something within the hotel. And when she heads to the hiding spot, the file that she hid was still there. But then suddenly, a police officer that Grace talked to earlier then shows up at the hotel, in a shockingly terrible condition as the officer suddenly falls very sick. Grace in a panic tries to figure out what's going on with the officer, but then suddenly he then becomes very hostile and tries to attack Grace, almost shot her point blank with a shotgun and then bites onto her arm. But luckily, Grace was able to get the upper hand and knocks him out the window. But then, as Grace tries to explore with a now bleeding arm, she then stumbles upon a room with a person sitting in a chair. This person so happens to be Victor Gideon, who is the main villain of this game. As he explains to Grace is that she is a very special person that he needs. And so now, with Grace completely trapped, he knocks her out unconscious. And while this is all going on, Leon is also in town as he's also on the case, as Leon actually knows on what's going on with the victims. As it turns out, is that all the people who have died were actually survivors of the Raccoon City incident 30 years ago. As it turns out, is that all these mysterious dips are actually from a remnant of the T-virus, where instead of turning them into zombies, it just straight up kills them. And to make things worse, Leon himself is actually infected by this virus, meaning that if Leon doesn't find a cure, he'll actually die. With the only actual clue he does have is Victor Gideon, who so happens to be a former Umbrella employee. And while Leon is stuck in a traffic jam, by sheer luck he then stumbles upon Victor, who is kidnapping Grace. And as Leon tries to go after Victor, he then stalls him by injecting these poor people with a modified version of the T-virus. And even though that Victor did escape, Leon does know where he's at. And eventually, once Grace was able to wake up, she finds herself tied up in this very corrupted hospital, as she's stuck in an area with this freaking monstrosity, where all Grace can do is just run and hide. And she almost became a graceful sandwich if it wasn't for Leon, who saved her in the nick of time. However, even though that Grace was able to escape from the monster, she's still in a situation of being trapped in this giant hospital. And so for now, the main plot of the game is just trying to find a way to leave the hospital. Although I must say, the opening section of this game is honestly pretty strong, as it sets up the plot really well with two characters having different motives, with Grace just trying to figure out a way out of this mess, and along the way, she befriends this blind little girl named Emily who's locked up in a cell. And I must say, their dynamics kind of weirdly reminds me of Claire and Sherry, where in the original story there was Claire finding this little kid and trying to protect her from this very dangerous zombie outbreak. Although speaking of which, Sherry does return in Requiem, as she assists Leon by doing all the research in the background. If you remember Hunnigan from Resident Evil 4, she's basically that. And since she was also a survivor from the Raccoon City incident, she's also affected alongside with Leon. And speaking of which, for Leon's perspective, the stakes are way higher, as not only he needs to stop Victor from doing his bioweapons at the cost of human lives, but also his own life is at risk because if he doesn't find a cure, then he'll die. And the funniest part of this is that even with all this in mind, he's still going in it in the most Leon attitude you can think of. Like seriously though, the moment Leon gets to the hospital, he sees a poor lady get brutally chainsawed right before his eyes. And all he can do is just make this response.
I think I want a second opinion.
And I think that's the one thing I love about Resident Evil Requiem, is just like its tone. Like every time when the game focuses on Grace, it's probably the most horrifying things you can think of. But the moment it switches back to Leon, it turns into a freaking action flick, with him saying probably some of the most campiest lines you could think of in the best possible way.
You know, I do have a question. When's the last time you brushed your teeth?
But other than that, I like how this game also has a very centric theme of facing the past, as Grace tries to put the trauma behind her after her mother's death, while Leon's story is him basically going full circle as all of the situations they had in the past comes back to bite him. Like, even though that Umbrella Corporation has been gone for years, there's still a lot of evil people that's trying to continue their work at the cost of human lives, with Victor's bioweapon of choice this time being a modified version of the T-virus, where it basically works the same like in the original trilogy where it turns people into zombies. In Requiem, it still does the same, but this time around, the zombies will still have their personalities back when they were regular people. And these dudes are freaking everywhere in the hospital, as Victor has infected literally everyone except for Grace and Leon. With the most messed up part of it is that all these people were working for Gideon, and this is how he treats his own employees. Alrighty, so jumping all the way to gameplay. Now, in Resident Evil Requiem, it's divided between two different playable characters. When you start the game, you constantly flip-flop them, where in the one section you play as Grace, while another one you play a little bit of Leon. They do this for like 1 or 2 times, but the moment that you switch back to Grace for a 3rd time, you're going to be playing as her for a good while. And the best way to describe Grace's gameplay is that it's basically like a follow-up to the Resident Evil 2 remake, as Grace needs to explore the entirety of the facility to try and find a way out of the hospital, but it's not going to be easy because the whole place is swarming with these zombies. So your main choices are either to sneak past them, run from them, or try to kill them. Luckily the zombies are pretty slow, so actually running away from them are pretty easy. But the real challenge is that since a lot of the rooms are pretty narrow, actually trying to get past them is a bit more tricky, with the only actual thing Grace can defend herself is just random items that she finds along the hospital. I think the funniest thing is that Leon does give Grace a gun, but it was a gun that only has 1 bullet in it. However, it's not an ordinary gun because it's actually something called a Requiem gun, which is basically a pistol that has the firepower of a freaking cannonball, with resources for this thing being extremely scarce, so you better use those bullets wisely. Other than that, Grace is equipped with a much more regular pistol that has way more bullets you can use, as there's stacks of bullets all over the hospital, as well as you're able to craft some more. Now, crafting has always been a regular thing for the Resident Evil series, as you craft stuff to make stuff like bullets or health. But in Requiem, crafting is a bit more different because you actually have a blood meter. So, throughout the hospital, you'll find stuff like random materials or herbs. But in order to actually craft them, you actually need to get a bunch of blood as well. Does this make any sense? Nope, not really. But at the very least, resources like this are pretty plentiful, as there's blood freaking everywhere in the hospital, for better or for worse. And all Grace needs to do is just use a syringe and insert a lot more blood into it. But keep in mind, every time Grace tries to collect blood, she's very vulnerable for a few seconds. So it's best to collect it if there's not a zombie after you. And as I said earlier, you use all this to do stuff like get more bullets, healing items, or these special syringes they're able to use for stealth takedowns. Or more like a loud takedown, as every time you use this on a zombie, they explode in a very over-the-top way. Although, even though they can use these to kill active zombies, it's also pretty wise to try and use them on zombies that are already dead. As for a couple of the zombies, even though if you actually do kill them, they'll actually rise up again and transform into these much more monstrous versions of themselves, who are not only much more faster, but also hit like a freaking train. And while we're talking about zombies, can we appreciate the zombies that are included in this game? As I mentioned earlier, the zombies are a bit more intelligible compared to the ones in the original trilogy. Although not by a huge margin per se, but a little bit enough just so they can have some of their old personalities. Basically what I'm saying is that for every zombie position, they're actually where they usually work at. Like around the east side, you have plenty of doctors and patients that are just wandering around, with the zombie doctors holding utensils as weapons, or this one zombie dude that's using an IV trip as a freaking bat. There's plenty of very unique and different zombies, with some of them having a very unique strategy to them. Now eventually Grace does figure out a way out of the hospital because all she needs to do is just collect these quartz. As throughout the hospital, there's these 3 MacGuffins Grace needs to collect, and they are the keys to open the door. Now the actual puzzle for actually opening them is very straightforward because all they have to do is just figure out the code. But the real challenge is actually trying to find the certain room because you're going to have to go through different rooms to unlock different doors. So it's best to try and search every nook and cranny in the room, see if there's a certain object you can use. And how you unlock certain rooms could be the most ridiculous Resident Evil thing you can think of. Like the fact that Gideon took this much effort to make a lock for the back door, and hilariously even Grace acknowledges how ridiculous some of these locks are.
Weird. How do people normally get in here?
I think the weirdest puzzle in the care center has to be with this guy in the surgery room, where as you can see here, this guy is dead. But he also has a wristband on his arm which allows Grace to access even more of the hospital. But the thing is that this dead body is restrained and the wristband is in the bandages. And so the only way to make them lose is to bring the guy back to life by using an unofficial lungs and heart. And I honestly find that was pretty fun, like the fact that the heart was in the freezer, while the lungs are...
What the f***?
Now eventually Grace was able to get to the final save for the quartz that she needs, but the problem is that she can't read it because it's only written in Braille. And so because of this, Grace needs Emily to help her out on this, which leads to a small section where you need to escort Emily into the room. And once you do so, you need to help Emily stall the zombies for a moment so she can solve the puzzle. However, the moment that Emily was able to open and get the final quartz, that giant monster from earlier comes in and kidnaps Emily. And so now Grace needs to explore the entirety of the cellar to rescue Emily. Now, for the main focus for this area are the special battery cores, where Grace needs to collect about 3 of them to open the cells. However, while she explores, she's constantly being stalked by the giant creature. And to make things worse, this thing is freaking unkillable, so all Grace can do is just run. With the only thing she can actually use to defend herself is, funny enough, the battery cores. As every time Grace plugs it into a socket, the lights will go on, which is the only thing that can actually harm the creature. And honestly, even though that it's not really as complex compared to the hospital section, I honestly really find myself really enjoying the cellar section, especially with the giant stalker enemy, who surprisingly has a very tragic story that I'm not really going to say too much in this video. But eventually, as Grace was finally able to open the cells, she rescues Grace and heads to the elevator. They finally reach to the first floor, but the monster at one last ditch effort tried to pull Grace down to the basement again. But luckily she was saved as the elevator door slices the creature's arm off. And I'll be completely honest, after playing through Resident Evil 7 and 8, I thought for a damn second that they were going to slice Grace's leg off. But luckily Grace is fine, and now she's finally able to leave the hospital. And since the hospital is far too dangerous, she also takes Emily with her. And luckily on the way out, there's a helicopter nearby with a pilot. Okay, so the helicopter crashed and Emily is now severely injured, as Grace takes Emily underground again to a safe place to tend her wounds. But the giant monster has returned, and so Grace decides to try and face off of it once and for all. Which leads to one final stealth section as you have to turn on the power. And once you finally do so, you can finally take the poor creature out of its misery. However, even though that Grace was able to defeat the monster, Emily sadly succumbs to her wounds. But unfortunately, Emily suffered from a fate worse than death, as instead of dying outright, Emily suddenly mutates into this giant monster that Leon unfortunately had to take out of her misery. And the cruelest aspect of this is that the game forces you to pull the trigger, while you just hear Grace cry in the background telling Leon to don't do it. And this right here really put Grace in a worse mental state than she was before, as she blames herself for Emily getting killed. And just like that, she then abandons Leon, and once she tries to find a way out, she gets confronted by Victor Gideon, who tries to convince her to come with them. As Victor explains, is that his main goal is trying to unlock something called Elpis, which was the final project ever created by Oswald Spencer. And he believes that Grace is the key to unlocking it. And with literally nothing else to lose, Grace decides to accept his offer. But not just that, but also we have the introduction of Diet Albert Wesker. And as for Leon, while his conditions is getting far worse, as the poor dude starts coughing up blood. But luckily Leon does know Victor's next move, as he's taking Grace to an umbrella facility known as the Ark, a place that's located right in the heart of Raccoon City.
I'm gonna find Grace. She definitely has something to do with Elpis.
Alrighty, so now for the second half of Resident Evil Requiem. So, how this game structures the character's story is that for the first half, it mainly focuses on Grace, as you see a lot of things about her, like her backstory and such, and how she survives through the hospital. The story does pan to Leon occasionally, but it's a lot more brief, as it mainly wanted to focuses on Grace. But the moment we head all the way to Raccoon City, this is when the story fully focuses on Leon. Now, with Grace's story, it's mostly her trying to face the demons of her past, while for Leon's story, it's mostly the same thing, but way more literal, as Leon's journey is trying to get to the center of Raccoon City. But the journey is not going to be easy, because even though the whole city has been taken down by a huge missile, a lot of the zombies survived the explosion and they're still roaming around the decaying place. But not just that, but also there's a military group that's also roaming around Raccoon City as well. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that they didn't really have the best of luck there. And after this point, this is kind of when the plot kind of pauses for a bit, as the gameplay takes full focus as Leon tries to traverse through Raccoon City. And the funniest thing is that the very first moment you head into the city, you're first being greeted with a giant enemy spider. Which ironically, out of all the Resident Evil bosses out there, this is the one that kind of made me wince a bit, because it's a giant freaking hairy spider, as all Leon has to do is just shoot in the back a few times and they'll go down. But after that, this is when we get to like the main section of Leon's gameplay, as there's this giant gate in the way that Leon needs to activate a detonator to have it opened. And the only way to do so is get all the parts from different BSAA camps. Now, jumping to the gameplay for Leon, I wanted to say this aspect later in the video, mostly because the first half was mostly focusing on Grace, as her gameplay mostly focuses on like the tension, the horror and such. It kind of feels like a spiritual sequel to the Resident Evil 2 remake specifically. But jumping all the way to Leon, his gameplay is more so in line with the Resident Evil 4 remake, where it focuses slightly less on horror and more on the action aspect, where instead of barely having any resources with Grace, Leon has plenty of items he can store up and have, as Leon's main shtick is ripping and tearing every zombie in his path. And honestly, this feels so unbelievably satisfying. Like going back to the care center as Leon, there was nothing more satisfying of ripping and tearing all the zombies that was giving you a hard time when you were playing as Grace. Whether if you're shooting bullets in the zombie's head with your regular pistol, or blowing a huge stack of them with your shotgun, with my personal favorite weapon in the game being the rifle, as there's nothing more satisfying than blowing a zombie's head off. And the best part too is that a lot of these zombies will pick up a good fight, as the majority of them will use weapons to attack Leon with, but luckily Leon has a hatchet he can use as a melee weapon, basically replacing the knife he had in past Resident Evil games, where it basically works exactly like it did in the Resident Evil 4 remake, where it's a good melee weapon to get close up with enemies. Like if they grab onto you, Leon can just swing his hatchet at them to avoid getting damage. Now, just like in the remake, the hatchet does have a durability meter, where if it goes out, Leon can't use it. But luckily you can refill it anytime you want, as Leon can sharpen the hatchet and use it instantly. With the only big hurdle is that it takes about 3 seconds for it to fully sharpen, and alongside that, Leon will be entirely vulnerable. And considering the fact that dozens, and I mean dozens of zombies will be going after you, yeah, it's better to strategize on when you want to sharpen your hatchet. Although I will say, it is extremely worth it because the hatchet is a very useful weapon, especially when you're trying to parry against enemies, as this thing will parry literally anything the zombie throws at you, including the dreaded chainsaw, where my god, out of all the elements in Resident Evil games, this is the one I'm always on edge on. But for the very first time, Leon is actually able to use the chainsaw against the zombies. Now actually grabbing it is a bit tricky because it's constantly flying around on the floor, but do yourself a favor and pick it up immediately because it just shreds hordes of enemies. And I think what really makes this all work together is that there's a pretty good incentive of defeating all these zombies, as every time you kill one you actually earn currency where you can use for a shop. It may not be a shadowy hooded man that is surprisingly friendly, but the shops here are practically identical to past Resident Evil games, where you can buy stuff like health or ammos. You can trade in your old items and replace them with even more powerful ones, and you can slowly upgrade each weapon to have stuff like more ammo or more powerful shots. And honestly, this is very fun to go through, as there's nothing more satisfying than collecting so much currency, and the moment you see those supply boxes, you get to slowly upgrade yourself and make you even more powerful to go against the various zombies in your path. And even though on paper, having the main focus just trying to find these detonating pieces would probably drag, I think execution-wise, they did a very good job, because for every single section in Raccoon City, there's some unique challenge that Leon has to go through. Like in one of the areas, you're underneath like this garage place, where you need to collect 2 fuses to proceed, and later on in the game, as you try to get gas from the gas station, the whole place catches on fire as you're going chainsaw to chainsaw on this zombie dude. Something that could be a bit over the top, like there's this one section where you need to dodge freaking missiles. But I think my favorite section is this one where Leon is slowly climbing up this tilted building, where one of the big challenges is that you're going against these zombies on top of a window, meaning that the glass breaks, you or the zombie will fall to your doom. And when all this is finally said and done, Leon grabs a motorcycle and starts driving all the way to the center of Raccoon City, which leads to this really cool rail shooter section as Leon needs to take down Gideon's hordes of hounds. And while Leon chases after Victor, this leads to probably the wildest moment in this entire game. I like how despite Leon clearly being way older than he used to be in past Resident Evil games, like he's pushing his near 50s, he's still able to do probably the most over-the-top crap you can think of. Honestly, even though that this section is basically a glorified rail shooter, I honestly like it. It's a pretty nice change of pace. And it ends off with Leon taking down Gideon for the time being.
Should've worn a helmet.
Okay, so eventually Leon was able to get to near the center of Raccoon City, with the only way to get to there is going through the one and only Raccoon City Police Department. The place that permanently changed Leon forever. And I've gotta say, it is really cool to actually revisit this place all over again. As I feel like out of all the sections in Resident Evil Requiem, this is the part where they just went all fan service with so many different Easter eggs within the building. Like, it's not the entirety of the Raccoon City Police Department, it's only just a few chunks of it. The stuff that you were actually able to explore is just filled with so many different details. Like when you visit the STARS office, you can see Jill's old hat. The entire music in this game is ripped from the original version, which is very cool. And occasionally, in a very cheeky detail, is that you can see a sentient tofu outside just wandering around. It's all pretty good stuff, and I know like these days there's like this very big stigma in terms of like fan service. Especially these days where it feels like every company is trying to pander to nostalgia in a way. But honestly, the way that they did this in Requiem feels very earned. As not only this is a pretty good way to celebrate the franchise's 30th anniversary, it also works pretty well for Leon's story in this game. Because keep in mind, this is the very first time Leon set foot in this place in over 30 years. It may have like the cheeky nods here and there, but the actual tone itself feels very depressing. Like 30 years ago, this used to be a very normal place where normal people just live lives, but all of that was taken away from them all those years ago, and Leon has never forgot about it. After all the crazy stuff that Leon has been through all these years, it was this moment that he'll never forget. And even though like these days Leon is like this very big super agent and such, but back then when the story of Resident Evil 2 started, he was only just like a rookie that barely started his first day. And the saddest thing too is that even though he was a cop, he really was unable to save anyone because it was just like beyond his control at the time. And the more you look deeper inside of like the journals of Raccoon City, the more depressing it gets. Like within the police station, you're able to find a journal from Marvin, where it said that everyone in the police station was very welcoming of Leon joining their team, even preparing stuff like pizza and beers to make him feel very welcome at home.
Hey, Lieutenant Brenna. Kennedy. Reporting for duty.
I think all this culminated once Leon was able to head back to the original gun shop, as the gun shop owner was trying to protect his daughter that unfortunately got infected by the T-virus, where the last time we ever seen them is him closing the door keeping his daughter safe. And now 30 years later, Leon opens that same door and all that's left is the remains of that poor little kid. A kid that could have had a very wonderful life, but was taken away so early because of the Umbrella Corporation's evil acts.
I'm so sorry. Never again.
But anyway, so as Leon explores the police department, he eventually stumbles upon Grace and Zeno. He explains to Grace on what is Elpis, and according to him, it's apparently some sort of mind-controlling virus, which was the final project Spencer has ever created. And apparently, the reason why Raccoon City was blown up with a missile all those years ago wasn't to eradicate all the zombies, but to keep Spencer's final virus safe. I would say that's a bit overkill, but at the same time, I feel like at that point, Raccoon City was just beyond saving. And as for the reason why they need Grace, well, apparently all those years ago, one of the projects that Spencer was creating was also a cloning process, as the Umbrella Corporation, quite literally, were manufacturing actual human beings, which included Emily, which was the reason why she was at the care center. However, this project went horribly wrong all those years ago, and we actually see like a little section of that. And I'll be completely honest, this is probably my least favorite part of the game, as it's quite literally a much more simplified version of the Sherry section from the Resident Evil 2 remake. Where when you first play through it, it is honestly very terrifying, especially when you're chasing down like these zombified children. These things are freaking terrifying, so they did a good job on that aspect. But the problem is that unlike the gray sections in the beginning part where you're getting chased by down that giant monster, with that was a pretty good challenge as you tried to avoid not getting spotted. But the problem with this section is that it's heavily scripted. You leave your room, you see the orphans, you run back to your room, you hide under your bed, you go out. You go into this hallway, oh no, the orphans see you run underneath this table, and boom, you just go through. And even story-wise, this doesn't really add anything that much new to it, as we already know that the orphanage was in cahoots with the Umbrella Corporation. And as for the kid, well, eventually she finds herself in the Umbrella laboratories, where she stoops around until one of the researchers captures her, and I guess after that, they killed her. The only thing we actually learned about this is apparently Grace was the original clone that was perfected. And thanks to this, somewhere deep inside of her head, she has some of Spencer's memories. This obviously sends her off the deep end, where I'm pretty sure she started having a panic attack right before passing out, leaving Zeno to capture Grace and send her back to the Ark, while Leon is distracted by a good old friend.
I remember you. I remember that too.
Yep, Mr. X returns, which leads to a small little chase section as Leon needs to run out of the Raccoon City Police Department, which leads to a moment that honestly really made me laugh. And after a pretty cool boss fight with Mr. X as well as this giant plant creature, Leon finally was able to get to the Ark. And as he traverses through the abandoned laboratory to try and find Grace, he also needs to deal with these military soldiers, where these guys are easily the most challenging enemies in this game. Because unlike the other enemies you face, which are basically just like mindless creatures, these guys are freaking packing heat. So it's really not advised to attack them head on. And eventually you end up in a small mid-boss section where you have to go up to their commander. Although the dialogue he gives me a bit of a head scratcher, because the way he talks to him sounds like he has a long history of beef with him. Although, the actual boss fight itself is pretty cool as it forces you to use your melee weapons only. But after you take care of the commander, you are able to confront with Zeno and Grace. Leon tries to fight the Faker, but considering the fact of his bad condition as well as the guy having superpowers, Zeno got the upper hand and was almost about to kill Leon right before Grace distracted him for a moment. And after Leon doing some quick thinking, they were able to escape from Zeno. However, since Elpis seems to be very dangerous, Leon needs to go back up there to try and destroy it once and for all. Which leads to two final sections where you play as Grace and Leon, as the game introduces one final enemy, which are the returning Lickers. But luckily at this point, Grace has enough items in her arsenal to deal with these guys, as eventually she finds herself in the main mother computer of the Ark, where she then realizes that the computer has a special disk drive that's exactly like the one in her mother's file. And so just like that, she inserts the disk into the computer. And for what was inside of it, well, it turns out it was an interview that Alyssa had with Oswald Spencer himself. And in a shocking turn of event, it reveals a side of Spencer that we've never seen before. As after the death of so many because of his company, Spencer ended up regretting everything he's done. And so in a way to atone from his sins, he started developing the project, which was Elpis. And this interview also reveals on who was Grace actually. As it turns out, is that she wasn't a human that was born in a lab or genetically enhanced or anything. No, Grace was actually just a normal baby. An orphan that Spencer took in to make amends of everything that he's done. And after this, he gives the baby to Alyssa to raise it as her own, where he hopes that one day this child will help him find peace. Which I've gotta say, that is one heck of a lore dump. And personally, I don't think the motivations for Spencer here makes him like automatically a good person. Like after everything he and his company has done, hell no, but at the very least, it does show a side where deep down, Spencer does regret the stuff that he's done. And after watching these interviews, this is when Grace figures out on what to do. And after going through an area that seems awfully familiar, Grace was able to reunite with Leon, who was literally at the brink of death. Like seriously though, at this point Leon can barely even walk. And as soon as they finally got to the centerpiece with the Ark and Zeno, he demands Grace to unlock Elpis or else Leon will die. And this is the part where the game gives you two choices, which is either to release Elpis or destroy it. Now the game heavily pushes you trying to release Elpis, but if you do destroy it, you get a pretty bad ending where Grace was able to escape, but Leon dies. But if you do release Elpis, this is when the true final battle begins, as Zeno injects himself with the Elpis, but instead of giving him like the mind controlling powers that he desires, it instead removes all the powers that he already has. As what Elpis truly was an antidote for all kinds of viruses. And so now Zeno is a completely normal human being, who became extremely furious at Victor Gideon, who suddenly returns, as he feels like he completely wasted their time and now just looks like a freaking dumbass. But Victor has other plans in mind, as he's going to be using the Elpis to basically destroy all of their competition. In the process, Victor also killed the Faker. You may be noticing I haven't really talked that much about Zeno in this video, but that's mostly because there really isn't that much to say about him. I'm sure there may be like some lore dumps that'll be appearing in this game here and there, probably from like future DLC, but for the time being, he's just basically like a stand-in for Albert Wesker. We don't even get a proper boss fight for him anyway. But we do get one for Victor Gideon.
Time to bury Umbrella's last skeleton.
The final boss itself is pretty solid, as it's mostly you just trying to dodge Gideon's attack and just going hell on him with all the ammo you got. Victor tries to retaliate with a freaking rocket launcher, but luckily Leon was able to retrieve it and use it on him. And of course, just like with every freaking monster in Resident Evil history, he doesn't go down for long as it just activates his second mutation, as Victor transforms into another version of the Nemesis, where all you have to do is just shoot at the obvious weak points until he goes down. And things off with Leon giving one final one-liner.
This time, you ain't getting back up.
Leon was finally able to take down the final remnants of Umbrella Corporation. However, at this point, they're basically trapped underground, but luckily they were saved the nick of time with the BSA soldiers. And thus the day is saved, as Leon was successfully able to cure himself from the disease, and was having a cure for everyone else that's infected by it. And Grace was finally able to put the trauma of her past behind. She does bemoan the fact that she was unable to save Emily, but Leon does give her a bit of hope. As it turns out, Leon did indeed spare Emily, because even though he did shoot her, she didn't shoot any of her vitals. And so eventually they were able to save Emily, and after that, Grace adopts Emily as her own child. Concluding Resident Evil Requiem. And overall, I had a spectacularly good time playing through this game. It's honestly amazing how much of a role this franchise has been ever since Resident Evil 7. And I think a game like this was a perfect way to celebrate the franchise's 30th anniversary. From the nice environments to the very interesting and labyrinthy worlds to explore, this game has a pretty good amount of tension and horror into it. And the best part too is even after all the horrors and scares wears off on you, all you're left with is honestly a pretty stellar fun game that has heavily, and I mean heavily, amounts of replay value. Which honestly, out of all the things in a Resident Evil game, I think replayability is always their strongest aspects. And this game does it pretty well. And to top it all off, it is honestly very crazy to be playing a AAA blockbuster game like this on a Nintendo console for the very first time in years. If you're very interested in Resident Evil Requiem, then I highly recommend trying it out, as well as the other Resident Evil games. They're all pretty good. And who knows, maybe in the near future I'll cover even more of the Resident Evil games, because out of all the horror franchises out there, Resident Evil is easily my favorite in the genre. But that'll do for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you later. Bye-bye!